In a courtroom wedding, millionaire woman weds man accused of theft, but her vows change all. Fluorescent lights of courtroom 4B cast an unforgiving glare across the assembled crowd, their harsh illumination reflecting off polished wooden. Benches filled with journalists, curious onlookers, and bewildered court officials. Outside, the autumn rain pelted the windows of the Manhattan courthouse, creating a rhythmic backdrop to what would become one of the most extraordinary scenes in the building's century-long history. Victoria Elizabeth Whitmore stood at the front of the courtroom, her designer navy suit impeccable despite the chaos swirling around her. At 38, she commanded respect in every boardroom from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. Her technology company, Whitmore Dynamics, had revolutionized data security systems, making her one of the youngest female billionaires in America. Yet today, she wasn't here as a CEO or a plaintiff. She was here as a bride. Beside her, 29-year-old Marcus Chen shifted uncomfortably in his borrowed suit, the handcuffs having been removed just moments before. His usually confident demeanor had crumbled under the weight of the accusations against him. The man who had once been Whitmore Dynamics' most promising software engineer now faced charges of embezzling $2 million from the very company that had launched his career. Judge Patricia Hawthorne had seen many unusual cases in her 25 years on the bench, but nothing quite like this. When Victoria's legal team had filed the emergency motion for an immediate marriage ceremony, citing urgent personal circumstances, the judge had been skeptical. When she learned the groom was the defendant in a major corporate theft case involving the bride's own company, skepticism had turned to outright bewilderment. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Reporters frantically typed on their phones, already crafting headlines that would dominate the evening news. Tech heiress marries alleged thief. Love or lunacy? Billionaire's shocking wedding. When romance meets crime, a courtroom love story. Marcus's public defender, a overworked attorney named Sarah Martinez, sat in stunned silence. In her 15 years of practice, she had never seen anything remotely similar. The prosecution team appeared equally baffled, exchanging glances that conveyed their collective confusion about how to proceed. Victoria's own legal team, led by the formidable corporate attorney James Blackwood, maintained professional composure, though their frequent glances toward their client suggested they too were operating in uncharted territory. Blackwood had tried repeatedly to dissuade Victoria from this course of action, warning her about the legal implications, the media scrutiny, and the potential damage to her reputation. But Victoria Whitmore had not built a billion-dollar empire. By backing down from difficult decisions, the ceremony began with Judge Hawthorne's reluctant acknowledgement of the situation's validity. All legal requirements had been met, despite the unconventional circumstances. The marriage license had been obtained, witnesses were present, and both parties appeared to be consenting adults of sound mind, though the judge privately questioned the latter assessment. As Victoria prepared to speak her vows, the room fell into an expectant hush. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the explanation that might make sense of the senseless. Camera phones were discreetly raised, despite the court's prohibition on recording. This was history in the making, and everyone knew it. Victoria's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the same authority that had commanded boardrooms and conference calls around the world. But there was something else there too, a tremor of emotion that few had ever heard from the typically composed executive. She began conventionally enough, speaking of love and commitment, of standing by someone through trials and tribulations. But as her words continued, they took on a different quality. She spoke of truth, of justice, of the courage required to right terrible wrongs. The crowd leaned forward, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Marcus stood frozen. Beside her, his face a mask of confusion and growing alarm. Whatever he had expected from this bizarre turn of events, it wasn't this. Victoria's words seemed to be leading somewhere specific, somewhere that terrified him more than any prison sentence ever could. The judge noticed the shift in atmosphere, the way the courtroom's energy had changed from bewildered curiosity to tense anticipation. Even the most experienced legal observers present seemed to sense that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Victoria paused, looking directly at Marcus for the first time since the ceremony began. In that moment, the pretense fell away entirely. Her next words would shatter the careful facade she had maintained for months, destroying the narrative that everyone in that room believed they understood. The rain outside intensified, and thunder rumbled in the distance, as if nature itself was building toward the revelation that would change everything. Victoria's pause stretched across the courtroom like a held breath. When she finally continued, her voice carried a steel edge that made everyone present understand they were about to witness something extraordinary. "Marcus," she said, her eyes never leaving his face, "I promise to stand by you, not because you are innocent of the crimes you've been accused of, but because I am guilty of far worse." The courtroom erupted. Reporters jumped to their feet, attorneys began shouting objections, and Judge Hawthorne slammed her gavel repeatedly, demanding order. But Victoria continued, her voice rising above the chaos. "For the past 18 months, I have allowed an innocent man to be destroyed while I remain silent about my own crimes." Marcus Chen did not steal $2 million from Whitmore Dynamics. "I did." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Marcus staggered backward, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally, devastating understanding. The public defender who had been preparing for what seemed like a hopeless case suddenly found herself at the center of what would become the legal story of the decade. Victoria's confession poured forth with the force of water through a broken dam. She detailed how she had systematically embezzled funds from her own company, using Marcus's security clearance and system access to cover her tracks. The missing money hadn't been stolen. It had been diverted to offshore accounts she controlled, part of an elaborate scheme to manipulate stock prices and conduct illegal trades that would have netted her hundreds of millions in additional profit. Irony was devastating. One of America's most successful businesswomen, worth over $1 billion, had risked everything for the chance to steal more. But greed hadn't been her only motivation. Victoria revealed a darker truth. She had been systematically destroying evidence of safety violations in Whitmore Dynamics security software, violations that had already led to 2 major data breaches affecting millions of users. Marcus had discovered the safety issues months ago and had been preparing to report them to federal regulators. Victoria had learned of his intentions through illegally monitored communications and had crafted the embezzlement frame to discredit him before he could expose her company's negligence. "I destroyed his reputation, his career, his life," Victoria continued, her voice breaking for the first time. "I watched him lose his apartment, his friends, his future, all while knowing that every accusation against him was my lie." The courtroom had fallen into stunned silence. Judge Hawthorne, despite her decades of experience, found herself at a complete loss for precedent. The prosecution team frantically consulted with their supervisors, while Marcus's defender realized she was witnessing the most complete vindication of a client in legal history. But Victoria wasn't finished. Her next revelation sent another shockwave through the room. The reason for the emergency wedding had nothing to do with love or loyalty. Under New York state law, spouses cannot be compelled to testify against each other in certain circumstances. Victoria had hoped to use the marriage as a legal shield, planning to claim spousal privilege to avoid having to repeat her confession under oath in a formal legal proceeding. "But standing here now," she said, looking around the courtroom filled with reporters, attorneys, and court officials, "I realize that some truths are too important to hide behind legal technicalities. Marcus deserves more than my silence. The people affected by my company's security failures deserve more. Justice deserves more." Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Why now? Why like this? Victoria's answer revealed the final piece of the puzzle. 3 days earlier, she had learned that federal investigators were closing in on the truth. Her scheme was unraveling, and it was only a matter of time before Marcus would be exonerated anyway. The marriage had been a desperate, last-ditch attempt to maintain some control over the narrative. I thought I could manage this like I managed everything else in my life, she admitted. I thought I could find a way to protect myself while still doing right by you, but there is no middle ground here. There's only the truth. Judge Hawthorne finally regained control of her courtroom, though the situation had moved far beyond anything in her judicial training. She suspended the marriage ceremony pending a full investigation and ordered Victoria into federal custody. The charges against Marcus were immediately dropped, though the legal implications of the afternoon's events would take months to fully sort out. As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, she looked back at Marcus one final time. "I'm sorry" seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what she had done to him, but they were the only words she had left. The aftermath would dominate headlines for months. Whitmore Dynamics' stock price collapsed, triggering a federal investigation into corporate governance and accountability. Marcus, suddenly free but facing the daunting task of rebuilding his shattered life, would eventually become a leading advocate for corporate whistleblower protections. Victoria's case would set new precedents for corporate crime and personal accountability. Her confession, delivered as wedding vows in a packed courtroom, would be studied in law schools for decades as an example of how guilt and conscience can overcome even the most carefully constructed legal strategies. The rain had stopped by the time the courtroom finally emptied. Outside, reporters gathered their equipment and rushed to file stories that would reshape public discourse about corporate responsibility, wealth inequality, and the price of justice in America. In the end, Victoria Whitmore's attempt to use marriage as a shield had instead become the stage for the most public and complete confession in corporate crime history. Her wedding vows, intended to protect her from the consequences of her actions, had instead ensured that the truth would finally, inevitably, set everyone free. The courthouse returned to its normal quiet bustle, but Courtroom 4B would forever be remembered as the place where a billionaire's lies crumbled and justice, however delayed, finally found its voice.
Thank you for watching this story unfold with us here on M&A The Story Unfolds. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of the world you're joining us from. Your support means everything. See you in the next story.